Hey there, survivors. It's David here. Thanks for tuning in to tonight's episode. If you're new here, please consider subscribing. It really helps me keep these stories coming. And while you're here, let me know in the comments where you're listening from. Now, let's get started. Thanks for stopping by. When our channel reaches 1,000 subscribers, we're launching a lottery giveaway, and one new subscriber will win an iPhone 17 Pro Max. Subscribe now and be in the race before it's too late. The place wasn't on most maps, and that was the point. We chose it because getting there required intent, not convenience. 2 hours past the last gas station, another hour beyond pavement, then a final stretch where even the ruts felt abandoned. When we arrived, the quiet felt earned, like payment for every bad road and wrong turn. I remember thinking nothing that depended on crowds would ever find us here. The terrain wrapped around the site in a way that discouraged curiosity. Hills folded inward, tree lines broke sight lines, and the nearest structure that wasn't ours had collapsed long before we showed up. There was no cell service, no signage, no reason for anyone to pass through unless they already knew it existed. Isolation wasn't accidental. It was engineered through neglect. We unloaded without rushing. That alone felt like a victory. No alarms, no instructions shouted over engines, no pressure to move along. We stacked supplies where they made sense and let the day finish without interference. Someone joked that the world could end out there, and we'd miss it. No one disagreed. That should have bothered me more than it did. The radio stayed quiet, except for static, which we treated as confirmation rather than warning. Silence felt like proof that distance worked. I told myself that whatever was happening elsewhere would take time to reach us, if it ever did. Time was the resource we thought we had stockpiled. As evening settled, the place revealed its real strength. Sound didn't carry far. Wind broke it up. Trees swallowed it. Even our footsteps faded faster than expected. I tested that more than once, walking away from the others just to hear how quickly presence dissolved. It felt like the land was willing to keep secrets. We made a fire only because the air cooled faster than anticipated. The flames stayed low, shielded by rock and slope. Smoke drifted upward and vanished. I watched it until it disappeared, and took that as another sign we had chosen well. Everything seemed designed to let us exist without being noticed. Dinner was quiet, not tense. Quiet like people who believe they've solved something. We talked about plans that assumed stability, storage, rotation, how long we could stay before boredom became a problem. No one talked about leaving. The idea felt unnecessary. The first hint that isolation might cut both ways came late, subtle enough to dismiss. A sound echoed wrong, not louder, just misplaced. We paused, listened, and let it go when nothing followed. Remote places amplify imagination as much as they suppress threats. I reminded myself of that and went back to what I was doing. Before sleep, I walked the perimeter alone, not out of fear, but habit. The darkness felt complete, uninterrupted by distant glow or movement. Stars looked closer than civilization ever had. Standing there, I felt insulated, like the world had folded away from us. I didn't know then that isolation doesn't stop events. It only delays their arrival and strips away context. When things finally reach a place like this, they arrive without explanation, without warning, and without options. At the time, though, all I felt was relief. We had reached the most isolated place we could find, and the outbreak still felt theoretical, something happening somewhere else, to people who hadn't gone far enough. I lay down that night believing remoteness was a barrier instead of a delay. I believed that distance functioned like a wall rather than a filter. The thought let me sleep longer than I should have. The land stayed quiet, the fire died cleanly, and nothing tested the edges we thought we understood. Somewhere far away, systems were already failing, voices were already going silent, and movement was already learning new paths. None of that reached us yet. The isolation held, not because it was strong, but because the moment hadn't caught up. I mistook that pause for safety, and that mistake settled in early, long before anything forced me to correct it. I slept convinced we had arrived ahead of disaster, unaware that arriving early only meant waiting longer for consequences to find us here without warning or mercy. The first full day passed without interruption, and that absence did more to convince us than any evidence ever could. Morning arrived cleanly. No distant engines, no smoke columns, no sound except wind threading through trees. The quiet felt deliberate, as if the place had agreed to keep us. We moved through routines with the confidence of people who believed they had outpaced whatever was chasing everyone else. We treated silence like confirmation. If something was wrong out there, surely it would announce itself. Surely we would hear it. Radios stayed on but unattended, their static reduced to background texture. No one suggested scanning frequencies more often. Silence had become a reward, and rewards encourage complacency. We split tasks without discussion. Familiarity filled the gaps where leadership usually sits. Supplies were checked once and left alone. No one counted twice. Counting implies fear of loss, and loss felt abstract. The place gave us permission to pretend nothing urgent was happening. I noticed how quickly we adapted to the lack of information. Without updates, speculation died. There was nothing to argue against. Instead, we built small rituals that assumed continuity. Coffee at the same time. Tools returned to the same hooks. Firewood stacked neatly for a future that felt guaranteed. The land reinforced the illusion. Trails disappeared after a few steps. Sound fell apart quickly. Even raised voices didn't travel far before dissolving into foliage. I tested that again, walking out until the others vanished behind trees, then calling back softly. My voice didn't return. The isolation wasn't just distance, it was absorption. That absorption made us careless in ways that felt harmless. We spoke freely. We laughed louder than necessary. Someone suggested expanding the fire ring for comfort. I didn't object. Comfort had become part of the plan without being acknowledged as a risk. The silence did strange things to time. Hours stretched without markers. Without news, days lost shape. We began measuring progress by meals instead of events. That shift felt calming, like stepping out of a current and onto a bank. Late afternoon brought the first moment of unease, thin enough to ignore. The radio clicked once, not a message, just a contact hiccup. We all looked at it, then away. The sound didn't repeat. One interruption doesn't break a pattern. We decided the equipment was aging and moved on. I walked the perimeter again, more slowly this time, listening for anything that didn't belong. Nothing answered. The stillness felt cooperative, as if the environment itself preferred us quiet and contained. I mistook that cooperation for loyalty. We talked about staying longer than planned. Not forever, just until things settled. Settlement assumes return to form. No one questioned the assumption because there was nothing to contradict it. Silence doesn't argue. As night approached, the quiet deepened instead of tightening. No distant sirens, no aircraft, no human noise of any kind. The absence felt complete, sealed. I remember thinking that even if the world was unraveling, it would have to work hard to reach us. We slept easily that night. Too easily. The kind of sleep that comes from believing tomorrow will resemble today. I didn't set a watch schedule. No one asked for one. Trust filled the space where caution should have lived. Looking back, the silence wasn't safety. It was a delay that removed context. Without information, we couldn't calibrate fear or urgency. We were insulated from panic, but also from understanding. That insulation felt like success at the time. The outbreak hadn't spared us. It simply hadn't reached us yet. And without sound to warn us, without voices to explain what was happening beyond our horizon, we filled the gap with confidence. Silence felt earned because we had travelled far and chosen well. We believed distance itself was a solution, not realizing that distance only postpones reckoning. When the quiet finally broke, it would do so without explanation, without gradual escalation, and without mercy. But on that second day, all we felt was relief. The place held, the world stayed away, and we let that feeling settle into us, mistaking stillness for protection and absence for control, unaware that both were temporary and already counting down. The message came through when we had already stopped expecting one, which made it feel more important than it probably was. The radio crackled to life in the middle of the afternoon, cutting across a conversation about repairs that didn't matter yet. The sound alone froze us. Static had texture. This was different. A voice pushed through in fragments, uneven and strained, as if distance itself were interfering. It wasn't a broadcast. It wasn't addressed to anyone in particular. It felt like someone speaking into the dark, hoping something would answer. We leaned in without moving closer, afraid that proximity might break it. The words arrived out of order. Evacuation routes mentioned, then dismissed. A reference to hospitals that no longer accepted people. A warning about movement patterns that didn't follow roads. The speaker never said zombie. They didn't need to. They described people who didn't stop, who didn't respond, who learned from sound. Description carries more weight than labels. The transmission cut in and out, each return raising hope just enough to hurt when it dropped again. We caught phrases instead of sentences. Too fast. Not contained. If you're hearing this. That conditional lodged in my chest. Hearing it meant we were already late to something. Someone reached for the volume knob and hesitated, unsure whether louder would help or harm. The voice faded before the decision mattered. Static reclaimed the channel and held it. No follow-up, no confirmation, just noise pretending to be absence. We stood there longer than necessary, waiting for another break in the static, as if patience could summon clarity. It didn't. The radio stayed alive but empty, like a room after a fight where words had done their damage and left. Debate followed, cautious and clipped. Some wanted to believe the message was exaggerated, a regional failure amplified by stress. Others fixated on the details that didn't fit ordinary disaster language. The lack of official tone mattered. This wasn't scripted, it wasn't filtered. That made it more believable than anything polished. I didn't contribute much. I replayed the fragments in my head, lining them up with what we had already chosen to ignore. The silence, the lack of traffic, the way the world had gone quiet all at once instead of gradually. Isolation hadn't protected us from the outbreak. It had protected us from knowing about it. The radio clicked once more, a brief surge that raised every head, then fell back into static. That was it. The last message that made it through arrived incomplete and left us with more questions than answers. Partial information is heavier than none at all. We changed behavior immediately, even if we didn't admit why. Conversations dropped in volume. Tools were set down more carefully. Someone suggested conserving fuel without explaining the urgency. Fear had entered quietly, wearing practicality as a disguise. That night, sleep came in pieces. I woke more than once, listening for sounds that hadn't existed before. The land remained quiet, but the quiet felt thinner, stretched over something deeper. Knowing there was danger without understanding its shape sharpened every shadow. In the morning, the radio remained silent. We tried different frequencies, different positions, even different batteries, as if the message had been a fluke we could reverse with effort. Nothing answered. The connection was gone, and with it the last thread tying us to context. That loss mattered more than the warning itself. Without updates, there would be no escalation curve, no sense of progression. Whatever was happening elsewhere would reach us fully formed or not at all. We would not hear it coming. We would not understand it until it was close enough to matter. I realized then that the message hadn't been meant to save us. It had been meant to prepare someone, anyone, for what normal language couldn't yet describe. It did its job by stripping away our assumptions. Isolation was no longer comforting. It was blinding. We didn't talk about leaving. We didn't talk about fortifying. We talked about nothing and did more instead. The last message had changed the air without changing the weather. It had taken the silence we trusted and turned it into something conditional. Whatever had begun out there was already in motion. We had simply arrived at our refuge before the explanation did. And now the explanation was gone, leaving us alone with fragments, forced to build understanding from absence while the world reorganized itself beyond our sight, moving steadily toward places that believed they were too far away to matter. For a while, nothing happened, and that nothing had reasons. The place we chose sat wrong in the landscape, tucked where movement had no incentive to pass through. Roads didn't point toward it. Trails faded before they arrived. Even animals used the area as a boundary rather than a corridor. We had mistaken inconvenience for security, but in the early days, inconvenience worked. Whatever spread through towns and highways followed habits first. Sound, density, repetition. There was none of that here, no engines, no clustered shelters, no patterns worth learning. If the outbreak moved the way the radio voice suggested, then it would have flowed around us like water around a stone, not because we were strong, but because we were uninteresting. Days passed, marked only by light and hunger. We saw no smoke, no distant movement, no signs of frantic travel. The land absorbed everything. Even our waste disappeared quickly, taken by soil and scavengers before it could signal presence. The environment was doing more work than we were, and we let it. The absence of zombies felt logical at first. If they followed noise, there was nothing to follow. If they clustered where people clustered, we had already removed ourselves from that equation. We convinced ourselves we had solved the problem by subtraction. What unsettled me wasn't what we didn't see, but how complete that absence was. Not even a stray figure, not even evidence left behind. It was as if the world beyond our perimeter had been erased instead of infected. Total absence creates its own kind of pressure. It asks questions without language. We tested the edges cautiously, short walks, pauses to listen. Each time the land returned nothing. No echoes, no distant calls. The silence felt earned again, reinforced by logic this time. Geography was on our side, we told ourselves. Geography doesn't lie. At night, the darkness stayed clean. No wandering shapes broke the tree line. No movement stitched itself into the horizon. Stars looked sharp enough to cut. The quiet pressed inward instead of closing around us, and we mistook that sensation for protection. Looking back, I understand why nothing reached us at first. Outbreaks don't spread evenly. They surge along lines of habit and infrastructure before bleeding into margins. We were a margin. The delay was real. The safety was not. Isolation bought us time, but time without information rots quickly. Each day without contact stretched the distance between assumption and reality. We kept acting like the delay was permanent, not transitional. That mistake shaped every choice that followed. The first days taught us the wrong lesson. They taught us that if you go far enough, disaster loses interest. They taught us that silence means success. They taught us that distance functions like immunity. Those lessons felt reasonable because they were temporarily true. Nothing reached us at first because there was no reason for it to. Not yet. The outbreak had no memory of us, no incentive to search, no pattern pointing inward. We were invisible, not invulnerable. Invisibility feels like control until something changes, and something always changes. I remember standing at the edge of the clearing one evening, watching light fail slowly. thinking that if danger ever came, we would have warning. I believed warning was guaranteed by remoteness. I didn't yet understand that warning requires witnesses, and witnesses were the first thing we had left behind. When movement finally arrived days later, it wouldn't come as a trickle. It wouldn't announce itself gradually. It would arrive fully formed, carrying everything we hadn't seen, all at once. But in those early days, the land held its breath with us. Nothing reached us at first because we had chosen a place that delayed consequences. Delay is seductive. It looks like victory. It lets you build routines that assume continuity. It teaches you to relax at the exact moment you should be learning how to endure. We lived inside that delay, mistaking it for safety, and by the time the difference mattered, the silence had already done its damage. By the 5th day, routine had replaced urgency. We woke with the sun, worked until heat drove us into shade, then repeated the cycle without questioning why. Living without updates made decisions feel lighter because there was nothing to contradict them. If no news arrived, then no new threats existed. That assumption settled quietly into everyone. We stopped checking the radio at set times. It sat nearby, present but ignored, like furniture that once mattered. Silence became background instead of signal. Without information, imagination dulled, and dulled imagination felt like peace. I noticed the change in how people spoke. Sentences shortened. Questions disappeared. No one asked what was happening beyond the hills because there was no answer to catch. When uncertainty has nowhere to land, it sinks inward and grows still. Food planning became mechanical. We ate what was easiest first, not what was smartest long-term. Without timelines, conservation felt abstract. Abstract problems invite procrastination. Procrastination hides inside comfort. The days blurred. Without outside reference, time lost urgency. Morning, afternoon, night repeated like a loop that refused escalation. That repetition trained us to believe tomorrow would mirror today. Stability doesn't need proof when nothing challenges it. I caught myself thinking in weeks instead of hours. That shift was dangerous. Long horizons make people careless with sound, with light, with movement. Carelessness hadn't punished us yet, so it felt earned. We talked less about contingency and more about improvement. Someone suggested building a better shelter wall. Another mentioned planting near the clearing. Plans like that assume permanence. No one objected. Objections require fear, and fear had gone quiet. The environment encouraged the illusion. Weather stayed mild. Nights remained undisturbed. Even animals avoided the clearing, as if respecting a boundary we didn't understand. Absence kept reinforcing belief. Without updates, we built narratives to fill the gap. Nothing elaborate, just small conclusions stacked together. If nothing had reached us, then nothing was coming. If nothing was coming, then staying still was correct. Logic without data feels solid until tested. I tried to remember what the radio voice had said, but memory fades without reinforcement. Fragments lost urgency. Words like evacuation and movement patterns turned vague, like warnings from a dream. At night, I slept deeply. That bothered me only in retrospect. Deep sleep requires trust. I trusted the silence more than I trusted experience. Experience had always included context. This did not. One afternoon, I walked farther than usual and realized how little we had marked the land. No signals, no listening posts, no early warning. We had assumed warning would announce itself. That assumption rested entirely on civilization habits that no longer applied. Still, nothing happened. Days continued to arrive empty. The lack of consequence trained us faster than any plan could have. Living without updates reshaped our instincts. We stopped reacting and started existing. That was the danger. Survival isn't just avoiding death. It's maintaining readiness when nothing forces it. Without information, readiness decays quietly. By the end of that week, isolation no longer felt strategic. It felt normal. Normal is powerful. Normal makes extraordinary threats feel unlikely. The outbreak hadn't reached us yet, but the absence of updates had already done damage. It had softened our edges, dulled our urgency, and convinced us that stillness equaled control. We were adapting, but not in the direction that would save us when silence finally broke. We did not notice the shift because it didn't announce itself. It arrived as comfort, as familiarity, as the easing of vigilance that follows days without consequence. When nothing demands response, response weakens. Tools stay where they fall, watches shorten, listening turns inward. The mind starts protecting calm instead of preparing for disruption. That was happening to us, quietly, efficiently. Isolation had removed urgency, and silence had replaced awareness. By living without updates, we were no longer tracking the world. We were waiting for it to interrupt us, assuming interruption would be obvious. It wouldn't be. When the moment finally came, it would arrive already formed, carrying everything we failed to imagine. The delay had cost us readiness, and we would not understand that price until awareness returned too late to rebuild habits we had already lost. The sign wasn't dramatic. It didn't scream disaster or force urgency into the day. It sat at the edge of our routines and waited to be noticed, which made it harder to dismiss once it finally was. I found it while checking a trail we hadn't walked before, not because we needed to, but because boredom had started to feel heavier than caution. The trail ended in a shallow dip where water collected after rain. At first, I thought the smell belonged to rot and mud, ordinary things that happen when ground stays wet too long. Then I noticed how the birds avoided the place. Avoidance teaches faster than alarms. Something had passed through recently. Not an animal. The ground showed drag marks that didn't match hooves or paws. Grass lay bent in one direction, not flattened by weight but pulled. I followed the line with my eyes and stopped when it reached a cluster of rocks pushed out of place. There were no bodies. That absence mattered more than a discovery would have. Evidence without a subject forces imagination to work harder. I backed away slowly, listening to how my movement changed the space. Nothing answered, but the quiet felt different, strained instead of neutral. When I returned, I didn't announce what I'd seen. Announcements create momentum. Momentum invites reaction. I asked instead if anyone else had noticed how quiet the birds had been. 2 people nodded without asking why. Shared observation does more than explanation ever could. By afternoon, we found more signs: a shoe near the creek, a scrap of fabric caught high in branches where wind couldn't have placed it. Each piece suggested passage rather than presence. That detail broke the illusion we had been nurturing. Isolation hadn't delayed the outbreak because it couldn't reach us. It had delayed it because nothing had taught it to come here yet. The realization settled slowly, heavy as humidity. We weren't late to danger. We were early to ignorance. We gathered and compared what we'd seen without dramatizing it. No raised voices, no conclusions. Just alignment. The pattern formed whether we wanted it to or not. Someone out there had passed through long after communication died. That meant the spread wasn't contained by distance. It meant time had been moving without us. The hardest part was accepting how much we had misread the delay. We had treated quiet as protection instead of warning. The land hadn't spared us. It had simply not been taught about us yet. That afternoon, routines changed without being declared changed. Tools stayed closer, voices lowered, movement tightened. Preparation returned, not as panic, but as correction. Corrections feel smaller than reversals, which makes them easier to accept. I walked the perimeter again at dusk and noticed details I had missed before. Paths that converged naturally. Sound channels created by slope and rock. We hadn't been hidden. We had been overlooked. The first sign we were too late wasn't a body or a sound or a sighting. It was the understanding that the outbreak had already learned how to move without us noticing. By the time we understood that, the advantage we thought we had gained was gone. That night, sleep came reluctantly, not from fear but from awareness. Awareness keeps the mind awake longer than panic ever does. I lay there listening to the land reintroduce itself, no longer as shelter, but as terrain. We didn't speak the conclusion out loud, but it was shared. Whatever was happening beyond the hills had progressed further than we were ready to admit. The delay hadn't saved us. It had cost us time to prepare properly. Isolation had bought us days. Living without understanding had spent them. When the first real contact came, it wouldn't feel sudden. It would feel overdue. That knowledge settled in quietly and stayed, changing how I listened, how I moved, and how I thought about the days ahead. I accepted that mistake without ceremony, adjusting expectations, habits, and vigilance, knowing delayed awareness could be deadlier than panic, because panic burns out, while ignorance lingers quietly, reshaping choices long before danger finally stands close enough to be seen, without warning or mercy, arriving unannounced. The shift didn't announce itself. There was no moment where we agreed the place had changed. It happened the way weather turns, gradually enough that you only notice once you're already wet. I realized it while standing still, listening to sounds I hadn't paid attention to before. Something echoed back. Not loudly, not clearly. Just enough to tell me the land was answering now instead of absorbing. A footstep traveled farther than it had yesterday. A dropped tool rang instead of dulling. The place was still remote, but it no longer felt private. We tested that quietly. One person walked away while another listened. The distance shrank. Sound carried through gaps we had stopped noticing. Trees that once swallowed noise now passed it along in pieces. The terrain hadn't changed. Our understanding of it had. That was when I stopped thinking of isolation as concealment. Concealment requires control. We had distance, not control. We altered behavior before admitting why. Fires stayed unlit even in cold mornings. Conversations broke into gestures. Tools moved hand to hand instead of being set down. The land felt closer to everything else, like a membrane thinning under pressure. The first confirmation came without sight. A sound moved where sound shouldn't have. Not animal, not wind. It followed a line too cleanly. We froze and waited for the mistake to reveal itself. It didn't. Whatever made it understood pause as well as we did. Later that day, we found proof where the creek benched sharply. Footprints that didn't respect water. They entered and exited without hesitation, tracking toward higher ground. Zombies don't plan, but they learn. Learning had reached our radius. We didn't call it an intrusion. Intrusion implies breach. This was overlap. Our space and theirs had begun to intersect without permission from either side. I noticed how people stood closer together now, unconsciously shrinking the usable world. Shrinking reduces exposure, but it also limits options. We traded one danger for another without discussing the cost. Someone suggested moving deeper, farther from the creek. I followed the idea with my eyes and saw how movement would redraw attention. Every step inward would teach paths. Staying still taught less. The land no longer felt indifferent. It felt observant. That change unsettled me more than any sighting would have. Being watched by things that don't care about fear removes the comfort of a negotiation. We adjusted the perimeter without formal planning. Natural choke points became boundaries. Clearings went unused. Trails blurred as we stopped walking them. The goal shifted from hiding to being forgettable. Zombies tested that shift indirectly. Shapes lingered longer at the edges, not advancing, not leaving, waiting. Waiting is how learning happens. I understood then that safety wasn't about preventing approach. It was about discouraging interest. We stopped using certain areas entirely. Abandonment is camouflage. The land looked less lived in by evening. That mattered. Night brought the hardest test. Sounds moved parallel to us, not toward, not away. The rhythm suggested familiarity. Something had mapped the area enough to know where not to go loudly. That knowledge erased the last illusion of secrecy. I stayed awake until exhaustion forced my eyes closed. Sleep felt like a gamble instead of rest. The place hadn't betrayed us. It had simply stopped shielding us from consequence. By morning, no one talked about being hidden anymore. The language changed. We spoke about timing, about pressure, about minimizing traces. Hidden implies invisible. We were visible. The goal became uninteresting. That acceptance altered everything. It stripped comfort from the idea of isolation and replaced it with discipline. Discipline is harder to maintain, but it doesn't lie. We no longer believed distance alone would save us. Distance had done its job and stepped aside. What remained was skill, restraint, and the understanding that the world beyond our refuge was now close enough to learn us, even if it hadn't decided to test us fully yet. When we stopped feeling hidden, we also stopped waiting for reassurance. Waiting wastes time. We began preparing for contact without expecting it, shaping our days around the assumption that interest had already been sparked and that our survival now depended on staying forgettable rather than unseen. The place hadn't changed. We had. And that change marked the end of safety by default and the beginning of survival by intent. Fear doesn't announce itself as fear. It shows up wearing other names and waits for permission to speak. In our case, it arrived disguised as logic. Someone asked whether staying made sense if the place was no longer quiet. Another answered with a list of reasons that sounded careful and measured. The argument began politely, which is how you know it's going to last. Distance split us in ways we hadn't expected. Not physical distance, but imagined futures. Some pictured motion as relief, believing momentum could outrun attention. Others clung to stillness, convinced that movement would finalize what curiosity had only begun. Both sides spoke calmly. Calm arguments are harder to stop because they feel reasonable. I listened instead of stepping in. Stepping in too early turns discussion into resistance. Letting it breathe reveals motives faster. One voice kept returning to control, the need to choose rather than endure. Another returned to scarcity, the math of fuel and food if we moved. No one mentioned noise. Noise is the truth people avoid when it undermines their preferred outcome. The land weighed in without choosing a side. Wind shifted, carrying sound farther downslope than expected. A dropped cup echoed once, then twice, bouncing where we hadn't planned. The argument paused long enough for everyone to hear the demonstration. Demonstrations carry authority, words don't. Someone accused someone else of fear. The accusation landed wrong because it was true for everyone. Fear isn't disqualifying, it's universal. What mattered was how it shaped decisions. The debate sharpened around leadership without naming it. People looked at me more often. I avoided returning the gaze. Leadership by consensus fails under pressure because pressure demands direction. Direction demands responsibility. Responsibility attracts blame. Blame is loud. I broke the silence by reframing instead of deciding. I asked what moving would solve that staying couldn't. Answers came quickly, too quickly. Relief, agency, progress. None of them addressed risk. I asked what staying would solve that moving couldn't. Silence held longer. That silence answered for us. Still, the argument didn't end. Fear needs repetition to feel heard. Someone suggested a test movement, a short relocation to prove a point. Testing creates data, but also teaches observers. Teaching observers is how patterns form. We walked the idea through without leaving. I described the sounds we'd make packing, the tracks we'd cut, the way roots narrow choice until choice disappears. I didn't dramatize. I let physics do the work. That shifted the tone. Resistance softened into resignation, which isn't agreement but functions similarly when time is short. The desire to leave didn't vanish. It went underground where it would wait. The most dangerous part came after, when frustration looked for outlets. Small criticisms surfaced. Someone's watch pattern, someone else's hoarding of tasks. These weren't about tasks. They were about uncertainty needing a target. I set a boundary without a rule. I said disagreements were fine. Undermining wasn't. Undermining fractures quietly. Quiet fractures fail suddenly. Everyone understood because everyone felt the risk. Zombies pressed closer inland that afternoon, drawn by other sounds we didn't make. Their presence settled the argument more effectively than authority ever could. External pressure simplifies choices. By evening, no one mentioned leaving. Not because it wasn't tempting, but because temptation had been measured and found too expensive. That didn't make us unified. It made us aligned for now. I knew the argument would return in a different shape. Fear adapts. It waits for fatigue, for hunger, for weather. What mattered was how we handled it the first time. We didn't explode. We didn't split. We learned each other's fault lines. That knowledge was uncomfortable but useful. Knowing who breaks under which pressure lets you plan around it. Planning around people is harder than planning around terrain, but more important, as night fell, the place felt tighter, not smaller, but more intentional. Arguments that only happen when you're afraid leave residue. That residue can poison or strengthen. We chose strengthening by refusing to let the argument decide for us. I lay down aware that fear had spoken and been heard without being obeyed. That balance is fragile. It requires constant attention, but for that night, it held. And holding mattered more than feeling right. We slept knowing the debate wasn't finished, only postponed by reality. Reality has a way of ending discussions without caring who wins. We found the body at a distance first, which is how these things announce themselves now. Not through shock, but through interruption. The path we used to cross the lower slope no longer felt empty. Something had changed its balance. I stopped walking because the land asked me to, not because I saw anything yet. It was lodged where runoff slowed, half hidden by brush that hadn't finished collapsing under weight. Clothing clung in the wrong places, soaked and heavy, stretched by movement that hadn't respected joints. The face was turned away, but the posture told the story clearly enough. This wasn't someone resting. It was someone finished. No one rushed forward. We stood in a line we hadn't planned, each of us stopping at a different distance, as if our bodies knew what our minds hadn't agreed on yet. The air carried that dull, sour edge that doesn't belong to weather or rot alone. Smell bypasses debate. It delivers conclusions directly. There were no obvious wounds, no blood sprayed dramatically, just damage accumulated through effort, through repetition. That detail mattered. It meant what had happened here wasn't sudden. It meant time had been involved. Time implies proximity. I crouched where the ground hardened again and traced the path backward with my eyes. The marks didn't follow the trail cleanly. They cut across it as if direction had been irrelevant. That erased the last comforting theory I'd been holding on to. This wasn't spillover from somewhere else. This was movement without destination. Someone asked if we should move the body. The question sounded practical, but it was really about control. Moving things makes people feel like they've acted. Acting without understanding teaches the wrong lessons. I said no, and waited for disagreement. None came. We backed away instead, not all at once, careful not to rush. I watched how our steps altered the space, how quickly sound returned once we moved together. Even restraint creates patterns if repeated. The body wasn't a threat by itself. It wasn't moving. It wasn't calling out. What it did was worse. It proved we were no longer ahead of events. We were inside them. Whatever had happened here had already crossed the distance we thought protected us. I noticed something else then. The birds stayed away. Not startled, not circling, just absent. Absence can be louder than reaction. It suggested this wasn't new to them. We changed behavior immediately without naming it. The trail closed, tasks shifted inward, conversations shortened. The perimeter we had imagined tightened around us. None of this was panic. Panic would have been loud. This was correction. Later, when the light shifted and shadows lengthened, I returned alone to check what the tide of time might have changed. The body hadn't moved. That mattered too. Nothing had come to reclaim it yet. That meant interest was nearby, but not urgent. Waiting again. I felt the urge to mark the place, to warn our future selves, and resisted. Markers create focus. Focus invites return. Memory would have to do. That night, sound changed. Not closer, not louder, but more purposeful. Movement passed beyond sight and didn't linger. I understood then that the body wasn't an endpoint. It was a data point. It meant roots existed we hadn't mapped. It meant our isolation had been penetrated quietly. Sleep came in fragments. Every dream ended with the same image. Not the body itself, but the space around it, disturbed and learning. The land felt different now, less neutral, more informed. By morning, insects had gathered. Nature resumes quickly when it decides something is no longer relevant. That efficiency was unsettling. It reminded me that we were part of a system we didn't control and barely understood. We avoided the area entirely after that. Avoidance became policy. Policies born of evidence last longer than rules born of fear. The first body that wasn't ours didn't bring horror. It brought clarity. It stripped away the last illusion that distance equaled delay. Delay had already expired. The outbreak wasn't approaching anymore. It had arrived quietly enough that we almost missed it, leaving behind proof instead of spectacle. From that moment on, every decision carried that knowledge. We were no longer preparing for possibility. We were responding to presence, and presence doesn't wait for permission to change what comes next. We learned that lesson the wrong way, through a mistake so small it felt insulting. Someone dropped a metal cup near the edge of the clearing. Not hard, not careless, just enough. The sound rang once, sharp and clean, then slid downhill instead of fading. It didn't echo back. It moved on. We froze and listened, the way you do after realizing you've said too much. The land answered with delay, not silence. A faint return came from the trees, altered, stretched, as if the sound had been taken apart and reassembled farther away. That scared me more than a shout would have. Out here, noise didn't radiate evenly. It followed channels we hadn't mapped, slipping through gaps in rock and root, riding slopes like rails. What felt quiet to us could arrive intact somewhere else. Distance didn't weaken sound. It redirected it. We tested that carefully, using things we could afford to lose. A stone tapped against wood. A foot scuffed dirt. Each action produced a different response depending on angle, moisture, and wind. The environment wasn't absorbing noise anymore. It was teaching it how to travel. That realization changed how we moved. We stopped thinking in terms of volume and started thinking in terms of direction. Some sounds vanished instantly. Others carried like signals. We marked those paths mentally and avoided them, reshaping our habits around invisible corridors. Zombies reacted before we finished adapting. Not directly, not as a rush, but we noticed patterns shift. Movement began appearing along the same lines sound traveled. Curiosity followed acoustics. That meant every mistake taught something that could be used against us later. We stopped setting objects down. Everything was placed. Placement reduced secondary noise, the kind that happens after you think you're done. Secondary noise is what gets you noticed. Conversation changed too. Certain tones carried better than others. Questions travelled farther than statements. We spoke in fragments and gestures, letting context do the rest. Communication slowed, but it stayed quieter. One afternoon, a shout echoed from far inland, human and panicked. It cut through the trees and bent toward us without asking. We didn't answer. Answering would have stitched us into someone else's disaster. The shout faded, then returned again, closer this time. Zombies followed it. We learned by watching, not participating. That event cemented the rule. Noise doesn't just reveal location, it builds roots. Roots become habits. Habits get remembered. We adjusted sleep patterns accordingly. Night sounds travelled farther downhill, so we slept higher when possible. Wind shifted rules hourly. Rain helped sometimes, betrayed us other times. The land wasn't consistent. It was conditional. The hardest change was emotional. Fear wants release, and release is loud. Laughter, arguments, reassurance, each carried differently now. We learned to feel without expressing, to process internally. That restraint cost us comfort, but bought us invisibility. Zombies tested the new soundscape repeatedly. A knock here, a scrape there. Each time we waited to see if curiosity escalated. When it didn't, we knew we'd made the right adjustment. Success arrived as boredom on the other side. I stopped thinking of the place as isolated. It wasn't isolated. It was acoustically complex. Complexity rewards attention and punishes assumption. We began to predict movement based on sound rather than sight. That felt backward, but it worked. Sound arrived first. Sound shaped interest. Interest shaped approach. By evening, the clearing felt quieter than ever, but not because nothing was happening. Because everything we did had been filtered through understanding. Understanding doesn't remove danger. It reduces teaching moments. That night, wind shifted again and rewrote our rules. We adapted without complaint. Complaints carry. Noise travelled differently out here, and learning that saved us from ourselves more than it saved us from zombies. Most dangers don't need to find you. You teach them how, one careless sound at a time. They appeared where we had stopped looking, which is how people usually do when you assume distance still works. I noticed movement at the edge of the tree line first, not the figures themselves, but the hesitation in how branches shifted and then settled again. That pause told me they were human before I ever saw faces. There were 4 of them, spaced poorly, trying not to be seen while clearly watching us. Their clothes were wrong for travel, too layered, too cautious, which meant they hadn't arrived quickly. They had been nearby long enough to learn something. That bothered me more than the fact that they were there at all. We didn't call out. Calling establishes relationship. We waited until they decided what kind of contact they wanted. Eventually, one stepped forward, hands open, voice low, asking if this place was safe. Safe is a word people use when they've already lost somewhere else. They said they'd followed signs, not smoke or light, but absence, an area where sound thinned instead of echoed, paths that looked avoided rather than used. Our caution had left fingerprints. I told them nothing useful. I said we were staying quiet and intended to keep doing that. Silence stretched. One of them nodded like that was the answer he expected. Zombies pressed indirectly as we spoke, not toward us, but toward the routes the newcomers had taken. The land reacted to their arrival the way it always does, by shifting pressure. I watched the realization cross their faces as distant movement answered their voices from places they thought were empty. They asked to stay nearby, not with us, just close enough to rest. I weighed the cost. Turning them away would create motion. Motion would teach paths. Letting them linger would do the same, but slower. Slow problems are easier to manage. We set a boundary without marking it, close enough to hear, far enough to separate mistakes. They accepted it quickly, which told me they understood rules even when they weren't spoken. That night, their presence changed the soundscape. Not louder, just different. New rhythms, unfamiliar pauses. Zombies adjusted. Curiosity shifted. The refuge felt smaller, more claimed. I watched them from a distance and saw the same habits we'd shed days ago. Setting things down carelessly, speaking in full sentences, laughing once, then stopping when it felt wrong. They were earlier in the process than we were, and that gap created risk. One of them tried to share information about the outbreak. I stopped him gently. Information travels, and traveling information attracts attention. He looked relieved not to talk. We slept lighter than usual. Not because we feared them, but because new people create new variables. Variables make noise even when they're quiet. By morning, zombies had followed the newcomers' trail far enough to prove the point. The group saw it too. Their confidence drained without panic, which I respected. Panic would have been louder. Others find the same refuge eventually. Distance doesn't belong to anyone. What matters is how you manage overlap when it happens. We hadn't lost the place yet, but it no longer belonged only to us, and that meant our margin had thinned again. I accepted that reality without resentment. Survival isn't ownership. It's negotiation with pressure. The newcomers stayed cautiously, learning faster than we had because we no longer made the early mistakes. Teaching by example costs less than teaching by correction. Still, I knew their arrival was a turning point. Refuge attracts attention the longer it exists. We had crossed from hiding to enduring. And endurance leaves tracks no matter how careful you are. That night I listened to 2 sets of breathing instead of 1 and understood the cost. We had gained people and lost invisibility. Whether that trade would save us or end us hadn't decided yet. The request didn't come as a demand. It never does. It arrived folded inside politeness, wrapped in reason, delivered when everyone was tired enough to consider mistakes. One of the newcomers approached just before dusk and asked if we had extra supplies. Not much. Just enough to get through the night. I knew what he was really asking for. Not food. Continuity. Permission to believe this place could support more weight without changing shape. I said no. The word felt heavier than it should have. Silence followed. Not anger, not pleading, just recalculation. Refusal forces people to redraw plans immediately. That redraw makes noise inside them, even if they keep quiet. We had enough to share once. We did not have enough to share twice. Sharing creates expectation, and expectation grows faster than need. I wasn't protecting what we had. I was protecting what would be required next. Someone on our side shifted uncomfortably. Generosity feels good in theory. In practice, it attracts repetition. Repetition becomes dependency. Dependency makes urgency louder. The newcomers tried another angle. Trade, skills, watch shifts, information. Each offer carried sound with it. Not literal sound, but movement. New routines, new conversations, new failures waiting to happen. I declined them all without negotiation. Negotiation teaches people where pressure works. Zombies pressed closer inland that evening, drawn by unrelated noise. The timing mattered. Refusal under pressure reveals character faster than comfort ever could. One of the newcomers accepted the answer and stepped back. Another stared too long. The third watched us instead of the land. Later, one of our group confronted me quietly, said we were becoming what we feared. I didn't argue. Arguments seek approval. I asked whether sharing would make us quieter. He understood the question and dropped it. Night tightened around the clearing. Hunger sharpened patience into something brittle. I could feel resentment forming across the boundary like condensation, slow and inevitable. Resentment isn't loud at first. It whispers. Whispers carry. We adjusted distance without announcing it. Moved sleeping positions inward. Reduced overlap of routines. Separation limits damage when mistakes happen. One of the newcomers crossed the boundary after dark anyway, moving carefully, carrying nothing. I intercepted him before he reached the fire pit and told him to go back. He hesitated, then complied. Compliance under strain doesn't last. I made note of that. By morning, the group beyond us looked smaller. Hunger had taken its toll. Fatigue, too. Zombies followed the weaker rhythms without interest in fairness. Nature enforces rules without commentary. We shared water again, because dehydration creates chaos quickly and loudly. That distinction mattered. Mercy can be selective without being cruel. I didn't regret the refusal. Regret wastes clarity. I catalogued consequences instead. Tension increased. Risk shifted. Control tightened. The shelter became more stable because it had refused to grow. What we refused to give up wasn't food or supplies. It was structure. Structure breaks when stretched beyond design. This place could endure pressure but not expansion. By refusing, we had drawn a line that couldn't be smoothed over. That line made us less likable and more survivable. Likability is expensive in collapses. Survivability is not. The newcomers learned who we were without speeches. They adjusted or they didn't. Adjustment is the price of staying anywhere that works. That night, movement drifted away from us again, pulled by louder opportunities elsewhere. The refusal had done its job. Quiet returned, thin but usable. I slept knowing we had chosen consistency over kindness and that the choice would echo later. Echoes are unavoidable. What matters is how far they travel. What we refuse to give up defined the shape of our survival more than anything we kept. It wasn't heroism. It was restraint. Restraint keeps places intact longer than good intentions ever will. The land didn't turn hostile all at once. It adjusted, the way systems do when pressure builds quietly. A week of steady rain softened ground we depended on for silence. Footsteps that once vanished began to hold shape. Water pooled where it never had, creating reflective surfaces that carried light and sound farther than we were prepared for. Wind followed the storms and rewrote our assumptions. Gusts moved unpredictably through the trees, lifting tarps, knocking loose items we thought were settled. Each correction we made solved one problem and exposed another. Adaptation became constant instead of occasional. Temperature shifts hit next. Nights cooled sharply, driving us closer together and closer to heat sources we had avoided. Closeness bred friction. Friction breeds mistakes. We countered by shortening shifts and rotating tasks more frequently, trading efficiency for control. The creek swelled and changed its voice. What had been a background murmur turned sharp and insistent, masking other sounds while broadcasting its own. Zombies responded to the change without understanding it. Drawn toward new noise corridors, the water carved through the landscape. Paths we had considered safe became guides. Vegetation betrayed us too. Wet leaves tore instead of bending. Branches snapped under weight that had once passed unnoticed. The forest stopped cushioning movement and started reporting it. We lost the luxury of predictability. Every day required reassessment. What had been quiet yesterday might betray us today. That uncertainty drained energy faster than fear ever had. One night, wind-driven rain collapsed part of our shelter. The repair couldn't wait. Waiting would have meant exposure. We worked carefully, but care doesn't erase sound. Movement gathered nearby, not from our actions alone, but from the cumulative lesson the environment had begun teaching. Zombies adapted faster than we did because they didn't need comfort or rest. They learned routes shaped by water and wind, lingering where conditions favored them. The land was no longer neutral. It was instructive. We responded by shrinking again. Fewer movements. Less surface area. Abandoned routines that assumed stability. Survival became reactive rather than planned. And that shift cost morale. People tired. Not dramatically, but deeply. Fatigue dulled judgment and shortened patience. I watched for the signs and intervened early, reassigning tasks before mistakes announced themselves. The environment didn't hate us. It didn't care. That indifference was worse. We couldn't negotiate with weather or terrain. We could only adapt faster than interest accumulated. By morning after the storm, the place felt altered beyond recognition. Not destroyed, but reconfigured. Familiar sounds vanished. New ones replaced them. We mapped again, knowing the map would expire soon. Isolation had delayed the outbreak, but environment accelerated it. Change exposed us in ways distance never had. I understood then that shelters don't fail only through attack. They fail when conditions shift faster than habits. We held on by refusing to chase stability. Stability was gone. Flexibility replaced it. That choice kept us intact, but it cost certainty permanently. The environment had turned against us not by aggression, but by evolution. And like everything else adapting to the outbreak, it didn't need permission to make survival harder. The realization didn't arrive as regret. Regret looks backward, and there was no value in that anymore. It arrived as clarity, sharp enough to cut away the last assumptions we had been carrying since the drive out here. Isolation had never been protection. It had been a pause, nothing more. A temporary delay that felt like strategy because it bought us quiet. We had confused distance with safety because distance removes witnesses. Without witnesses, disasters feel smaller, theoretical. You don't hear the panic. You don't see the collapse. You don't feel the speed. All of that had happened elsewhere while we were learning how to be comfortable in silence. Isolation hid the outbreak from us, not the other way around. By the time evidence reached our perimeter, bodies, sounds, patterns, the world had already reorganized itself. Systems had failed, adapted, and disappeared without our involvement. We weren't ahead of the collapse. We were behind its explanation. That distinction mattered more than supplies or terrain. I thought back to the first nights here, how confidently we spoke about time. Time to plan, time to wait, time as a resource we believed we owned. We never questioned where that time came from or what it was costing us in awareness. While we waited, the outbreak learned. It learned roots, responses, rhythms. It learned how people moved when they were desperate, and it carried that knowledge forward. When it finally reached us, it didn't arrive confused. It arrived experienced. Isolation also stripped us of comparison. Without seeing worse places, we assumed this one was good. Without hearing failure, we mistook quiet for success. That mistake shaped our early habits, softening us in ways that only became visible once correction was required. Staying alive here had stopped being about location and become about discipline. Discipline in movement. Discipline in sound. Discipline in denial. We weren't surviving because the place was remote. We were surviving because we had learned how to take up less space in the world. That lesson was transferable. The location wasn't special anymore. The habits were. The newcomers understood that faster than we had. They hadn't romanticized the place. They saw it as one option among shrinking options. That perspective hurt to accept, but it was necessary. No place was immune. Only behavior delayed attention. I stopped thinking of this place as a refuge and started thinking of it as a test. Not of endurance, but of restraint. How little could we need? How quietly could we exist? How often could we refuse action even when action felt productive? Isolation was never protection, because protection implies a barrier. There was no barrier. There was only absence, and absence fills eventually. What mattered was what happened. When it did. We accepted that leaving might become necessary one day, not because things got worse here, but because they got louder elsewhere. Movement would be chosen reluctantly, carefully, without hope attached. Hope makes plans sloppy. For now, staying still remained the quieter choice, not the safer one. Just quieter. and quiet still mattered. The outbreak hadn't spared us. It had simply taken longer to acknowledge us. That acknowledgement came without ceremony, without escalation, without apology. Once it arrived, it behaved the same way it did everywhere else. Predictable, persistent, uninterested in intention. I slept that night without believing in protection. Belief wastes attention. I slept believing in adjustment. Adjustment keeps you alive longer. When morning came, nothing had improved. Nothing had collapsed. That was enough. Survival wasn't about winning. It was about not losing today. Isolation had given us time, and time had given us habits. Habits were the only thing standing between us and the same mistakes being repeated louder somewhere else. I stood at the edge of the clearing and listened to the world we were now part of again. Not separate. Not hidden. Just quieter than most. Quiet enough to be overlooked for another day. That was the truth isolation had taught us too late. It doesn't stop the outbreak. It only delays the moment you understand it. What you do with that delay decides whether you're still alive when understanding finally arrives.